Okay, welcome to 1991, and I reckon we ought to check back in with the Cold War and see how it's going. And here comes the collapse of the entire stinking Soviet Union, and that's gonna end the Cold War quick, fast, and in a hurry, so let's talk about it. If you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. Okay, now there are about 1,000 causes for the end of the Cold War, but in this video we're gonna talk about 3 of the main causes, and the first is the technological and military advancements of the United States. So by the early 1980s, the US and the Soviet Union had produced over 12,000 nuclear missiles, and all those weapons of mass destruction were pointed at one another. And a major consideration that kept their respective fingers off the launch buttons was the guarantee that if either did start a nuclear war, it would certainly end in mutual assured destruction. Even so, it was tense between the two powers for a long time. However, that tension did relax somewhat during a period of détente in the 1970s. For example, US President Richard Nixon and Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, better known as SALT I, in which both states agreed to prohibit further manufacture of nuclear weapons. But then in 1980, the US elected Ronald Reagan as president, and he took a much harder line against the Soviets and decided to take that détente and flush it down the toilet. To that end, Reagan spearheaded the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI. It was a system that rendered any attack on the US by nuclear weapons obsolete. And how would that be? Well, the SDI sought to launch defense systems into space that could detect a nuclear launch and shoot them down from space with lasers. Like they were going to shoot down nuclear missiles from space with lasers. And therefore, it was no wonder that the detractors of this plan dubbed it Star Wars. And look, even though the SDI never really came to pass, it represented a growing divide between the US and the Soviet Union. Reagan believed that the Soviets would attempt to match the US spending in weapons development, and in large part, he was right. But the problem was that since the 1970s, the Soviet economy had been stagnant and could not support that kind of spending. Therefore, the Soviet attempts to keep up with the US military and technological investment led them into further economic decline. Oh, and by the way, let me just mention that if you need help studying for your AP exam, you might want to grab my AP World Heimler Review Guide, which has everything you need to study as fast as possible. It's got whole unit review videos that you're not going to see here on YouTube, note guides to follow along, practice questions, practice exams, and answer keys for every dang bit of it. So if that's something that you're into, check the link in the description. Okay, now the second cause of the Soviet collapse and the end of the Cold War was the failed Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So in 1979, Soviet troops invaded Afghanistan in order to prop up its communist regime against Afghan Muslim groups that had sought to overthrow it. However, the Afghan rebels were supported and supplied by the United States and Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. And so, while the Soviets were able to control some of Afghanistan's major cities, they could not win the rural guerrilla war waged against them by the rebels. And so, all in all, the Soviet Union waged this losing battle for 9 years, and that effort further depressed the Soviet economy. And the third cause and final nail in the coffin for the Soviet Union was the policies of Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, who rose to power in 1985. Now, in addition to what I just mentioned about a second ago about Soviet economics, in the later 1960s and early 1970s, the Soviet economy was in a crisis. Like, foreign trade was extremely limited. And then government control of agriculture stifled that industry because farmers didn't have enough freedom to decide what to plant and how much to sell their crops for. Additionally, Eastern European Soviet bloc countries were growing more and more discontent with Soviet oppression. For example, the Prague Spring, which was a series of mass protests in Czechoslovakia, erupted in 1968 as a reaction against oppressive Soviet policy. And the Soviets violently crushed this outcry, but the sentiment was spreading, and the Soviet state was having to devote more and more resources that they did not have to putting those rebellions down. With all this background, the liberal reformer Mikhail Gorbachev enters stage right with some policies in his pocket that's ultimately going to lead to the demise of the Soviet Union. The first policy was known as perestroika, which was a restructuring of the economy to address all their economic woes by reducing the level of central planning from the government. His second policy was known as glasnost, which means openness. And under this policy, all the dissent and the criticism against the government and its policies that had so long been brutally silenced by previous leaders was now allowed. And as it turns out, there was a lot of it. And then third, Gorbachev decided that the Soviet Union would no longer use military intervention in order to prop up communist governments in its own sphere of influence. And with those developments, satellite states in the Soviet bloc took quick advantage of the loosening Soviet grip. So democratic reform movements erupted in one Eastern European country after another, and that led to similar reform movements in the Soviet Union proper as people in Lithuania and Georgia and other states began declaring independence and breaking free from Soviet control. And then in 1989, the Berlin Wall was torn down and Germany was reunited. And in response to all these destabilizing forces, the Soviet legislature voted in 1991 to dissolve the Soviet Union, thus marking an end to the Cold War. Okay, we're at the end of another unit, so click here if you want to grab my AP World Heimler Review Guide, which has everything you need to study as fast as possible for that national exam. And you can click here to keep reviewing my other unit videos if that's the kind of thing you're into. It was good to see you, and I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.